The COVID-19 pandemic had devastating economic and social consequences in the global south. In terms of sectors, one of the most affected was the continent's tourism sector. From passenger flight numbers plunging to revenue from tourists basically disappearing overnight, for African tourism, the loss of earnings as a direct result of the coronavirus pandemic are estimated at $250 billion for 2021. A report from the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development expects that there will only be some kind of return to normal in 2023. UNCTAD estimates that the near total shutdown for tourism in 2020 deprived Tunisia and Morocco of 79% of their international visitors. Other countries dependent on the sector were also hit. The drop was 78% for Mauritius, 72% for Kenya, 70% for South Africa, 69% for Egypt and Ethiopia, 55% for Ghana, and 43% for Madagascar. Tourism is an important driver of economic growth around the world. Blessed with beaches, cultural sites, and abundant wildlife, prior to the pandemic, Africa had the second fastest growing tourism sector in the world. In fact, tourism represents about 8.5% of Africa's GDP and employs around 24 million people. One of the continent's most popular tourist destinations is South Africa. And here is the scope of this sector. Around 1 in every 22 working South Africans are employed in the tourism sector. South Africa is said to have the second largest tourism industry in Africa, which is also about 7% of the country's GDP. Now, after all the hits that the sector took with COVID-19, the sector looks set for recovery after President Cyril Ramaphosa announced an easing of most lockdown restrictions, including a curfew. Today, we'll be focusing on the road to recovery for South Africa's tourism sector. This is Business Edge. I'm Tolulope Adeleru-Balogun. Joining me from Pretoria, South Africa is Tshivhengwa. He's the CEO of the Tourism Business Council of South Africa. Tshifhiwa, thank you so much for joining us on Business Edge.
Thank you very much for having me, and it's a pleasure.
All right. Now, for us to get a picture of how much the easing of the lockdown restrictions and the COVID-19 restrictions means for South Africa's tourism sector, I think we need to take a look at how COVID-19 really devastated the industry as it was. So tell us, how devastating was the pandemic for the sector?
Well, here in South Africa, we are very much dependent on tourism. It is an important sector of our economy in general. And when we look at it, outside of mining, tourism is the second largest economy here, in South Africa, and has many people working underneath it. So if we cast our eyes back in the past 2 years, we have seen how the impact of COVID-19 has had in our sector. Many people lost their jobs. Around 470,000 people lost their jobs, both direct jobs and indirect jobs. We've seen many businesses, both formal and informal businesses, closing their doors. And we've seen many entrepreneurs really struggling to stay afloat, and many of them really leaving the industry, to find work elsewhere. So we have seen many people losing their jobs. We have seen many entrepreneurs exiting the industry. And more importantly, the informal side of tourism businesses have been highly impacted. And we have seen how people who work around the beaches, on the side of the road, selling artifacts and crafts have been impacted. So it's been a devastation here in South Africa. And across the African continent, it will be the same. Yes. And it only means that we need to work harder to go back to where we were, or to do better than where we were. But the impact is felt on the ground. It's felt by everyone who works in the industry. Many people are still suffering, and they're going to continue to suffer for the short term. We hope that we'll be able to get back to some level of higher trading figures to ensure that we impact the economy positively.
So you talked about the direct and indirect jobs, but tourism is not an industry that stands on its own. There are a number of other industries or sectors that also were impacted because of the impact of the tourism sector. So who also took indirect hits because the tourism sector was affected?
Well, when you look at the value chain of tourism, you realize that we touch every aspect of the economy. There's very few economic sectors that tourism doesn't touch, and that's why we always talk about tourism being everybody's business. And we also talk about a whole of government approach to tourism. So if you look at car manufacturing here in South Africa, 12.5% of all locally produced cars are bought by the tourism sector, for vehicle rentals. If you look into retail, almost 15% of retail is done, by tourists. And the list goes on. You look at agriculture, how much you impact agriculture in terms of buying the food. If you look at those that are processing the food, when we had the entire industry closed, some of the companies that were coming to us were the big food companies that supplies to hotels, that supply to cruise ships and lodges and many other places, because for them, that's a significant part of their business and they wanted us to be open. So you can look into the entire value chain, someone who's at the petrol station, along the major route, they are there because there are many people who are traveling around the country, and that petrol station survives because people are doing domestic travel or international travel. So it's quite important that we look at it very broadly and we look at all aspects where we touch, from airlines to the people who work at immigration, to the people, as I've said, who work at the petrol stations, accommodation, restaurants, informal restaurants on the side of the roads. Everyone is impacted. So that is why it's important that when tourism thrives, many subsectors of the economy thrive as well, because we touch almost every aspect of the economy.
So in giving me this answer, you did mention about government's approach to the tourism sector. So let's talk about that in light of COVID-19. It's reported that small businesses make up around 80% of the travel and tourism industry for South Africa. And businesses reported revenue being down, inability to make their loan payments, inability to cover fixed costs. Some, as you said, also had to lay off workers, and others actually chose to drastically reduce wages so that they could keep staff on. So the question here is, in terms of COVID-19 and support and how critical the tourism sector is to the South African economy, what did government do in order to be able to support the industry through the worst of the pandemic?
Well, there were programs that government here in South Africa, put together in terms of giving relief to small businesses. But when I look at the figures that were allocated, it was nearly not enough. We had around 200 million rand that was distributed to over 4,000 companies. And there were many other companies, that needed the relief, but they couldn't get it. And the quantum of the amount was quite small to get the business to be resilient. So there were programs and there were other programs that were provided, but they were not suitable for small businesses. And we had to go back and discuss, because you cannot give a government guaranteed loan scheme but using the bank rules to approve those loans. And therefore, small businesses were not able to participate meaningfully. But what's important and what we need to build in is the resilience. The fact that we have many small businesses, when they're hit by the pandemic, they all went under. And very few of them were left standing. It means that, the balance sheet is not strong enough. There isn't much resilience. The question becomes, how do we build resilience into these small businesses that we talk about in South Africa and across the continent that we know employs a whole lot more people than formal businesses? We need to build in resilience. We need to make sure that the SMMEs are well equipped. They can survive the shocks that we have, within the system. And what we've seen with the pandemic is that, they cannot. And that's why now we are putting together programs that deals with resilience, that makes sure that, the small businesses can, sustain some of the impact of this type of shocks, and they can be able to be sustainable and go, forward with the work that they're doing. They are important because in tourism, we sell experiences, and small businesses comes up with unique experiences that may not be there in the normal course of doing businesses. And therefore, you will see that there's a lot of people who want to come back, to enjoy those type of experiences. So let's build resilience, and let's make sure that when we do have these relief measures, they are targeted to small businesses. And we understand that small businesses may not have the large balance sheet, to sustain, like big businesses. So we've got to build up, and we've got to make sure that there's resilience.
Okay, so you talk about small businesses being able to provide the type of experience that a tourist may not have with the big formal chains. And it's interesting because a lot of times when we talk tourism, we tend to focus on international travelers. And in the course of COVID-19, many countries try to now focus on the domestic tourist, on the domestic traveler within their regions or within their country boundaries because of the COVID-19 pandemic. But for South Africa, the domestic traveler would have been hit with the same restrictions and the same measures that the international tourist was. So, was there any impact that the tourism industry felt from the domestic traveler in the past 2 years, of which South Africa had to bear the issues of the COVID-19 restrictions?
Well, absolutely. What we've seen is that, and when we talk about the recovery of the tourism industry, we've always said that it's going to start from domestic. And indeed, it did start from domestic. And we saw that a lot of South Africans really traveled their own country, supported us as the sector. And when we look at the figures last year, December, from the revenue point of view, we saw that we did around 50% of what we did in 2019, which was better than the 2 years that were under strict lockdown. So domestic travel is key. Another thing that really contributed to this is that a lot of South Africans were unable to travel out of the country because of the red listing. So therefore, they traveled their own country, and of course, it had a positive impact. What we need to improve on is how do we integrate as a region? A lot of countries in the Southern Africa development community, and I'm sure this is the same problem in East Africa, probably the same problem in the ECOWAS. How do we make sure that the protocols of entry and exit, are aligned so that people can be able to travel regionally? Domestically, yes, we did fine, but we could have done better as a region had we worked together properly to make sure that our COVID-19 protocols for entry and exit are aligned. People who were coming into the country, the few who were able to come into the region, are able to travel to various countries. But when we failed on doing that, and it's something that we definitely need to work together so that we're not in silos and we prevent tourists from moving around the region. But in South Africa, domestically, we did very well. Many people travel. There's still a huge room for improvement because we still have corporate travel, not fully functional. We still need to get people back into the stadium so that sports tourism can move ahead. We need conferences and many other aspects of tourism to continue.
Okay, and we're going to get to that now because President Cyril Ramaphosa recently announced a lot of lockdown easing, and I know that there's going to be some smiles finally after 2 years of very severe restrictions. So we'll get into that part of this conversation and also look at the conversation happening around the proposed national labor migration policy and how that might also affect the tourism sector. So hold the line. Today, the conversation is on the road to recovery for South Africa's tourism industry, the second largest tourism industry on the continent, responsible for about 7% of the country's GDP and employing around 1.9 million, or around 1 in every 22 working South Africans in this industry. A critical one, and one that needs to recover so that South Africa itself can also be on the road to recovery. The conversation will continue after this. And still with me is Tshivhengwa. He's the CEO of the Tourism Business Council of South Africa as we look at the tourism industry's road to recovery. Now, President Cyril Ramaphosa recently announced a number of changes to South Africa's COVID-19 restrictions. Masks are no longer required outdoors. There are changes to regulations for the event. There's no more pre-departure PCR tests for international travelers coming to South Africa. And we also saw the first in-person Invest SA, or rather South African Investment Conference happen for the past 2 years. So we see that South Africa is reopening now for the international community. Of the changes that the president outlined, which ones do you think will have the biggest impact on the tourism industry?
Well, indeed, we have seen, the president really opening up the country and relaxing some of the regulations. We have been discussing this for the past few months to say we could have done this earlier than what we did, but be that it may, we have done it now. One of the biggest, that was inhibiting the growth of tourism was the issue around the negative PCR test for those that want to travel to South Africa when they are fully vaccinated. And we have been talking about that as one of the areas that we need to improve on and we needed to announce so that we can be competitive. And we did some studies that, in the UK, as an example, 37% of would want to be travelers were really deterred by the fact that they still need to do the PCR test before they travel. So we are happy that issue is dealt with. We are also happy that the issue of the gathering sizes have been increased in terms of the conferencing, indoor and outdoor, and the capacity at many buildings have been increased to 50%. The issue around the masks for outdoors, has been dealt with. And also the issue around the social distancing have been dealt with. And these are quite important for our industry because people want to go to a place where, there's a little bit more relaxed environment. And especially for us, in the tourism space, whereby a lot more people spend time outside and our tourism infrastructure allows for people to be in safaris, in open spaces. And when we took out the mask, it simply means that we're saying you are allowed to be in the country, you're allowed to be free, and you're allowed to be alive again and enjoy the beauty of the country without wearing masks. But I think those were the critical steps. And I think that going forward, we need to look at other steps to make sure that, we're able to deal with those and we're able to move forward.
What other steps do you think? Because that was the next question. So you said it was some progress, but it makes it seem like there was more you would have wanted the president to ease up on. What else would the tourism sector actually need in the coming weeks or months?
Well, we need to deal with the issue of sporting events. Sports is quite important. People move around the country, follow their teams or clubs, and they contribute greatly, to the tourism sector. We need to look at increasing the numbers for those that can attend sporting events. We also need to look at increasing the numbers for conferencing so that we don't only do 50%, but let's move to a higher figure that will support the recovery of the tourism industry. We also need to look at other regulations that may no longer be relevant for the management of COVID. And those include, as I've said, the issues around, those travelers that will still need, PCR tests when they're fully vaccinated. There are many countries that are moving out and saying that, anyone can come into the country, whether you're vaccinated or not. We're going to have to look at that at some point to make sure that, we progress on the same pace that other countries, are looking at. And also the regulations of managing COVID. We believe that, they've done what they needed to do. We manage the situation better. It may be time to really relax all the regulation and just leave those that are necessary and allow people to make decisions by giving them guidelines to manage COVID instead of regulating people's behavior. So those are the type of things that we need to get into. We need to discuss, we need to move on, and we need to make sure that we move on carefully. But let's give people the power back to be able to do what they're supposed to do by giving them guidelines and norms and standards.
Okay. So let's talk about the proposed national labor migration policy. Right now, South Africans can comment on some of those proposals. What is the stand on the council of some of these proposed measures that particularly directly impact the industry, given the fact that small businesses in the tourism industry are implicated in actually employing illegal migrant workers?
Well, that has been, under discussion for quite a number of years in terms of how do we deal with the situation that we have here in South Africa. There are two parts to this. The first part to this is that, there are illegal foreign migrants who are here, to seek jobs or to seek economic opportunities. That's one, part of it. And there are those who are here in the country legally. Just like many South Africans travel the world legally and they work in many different parts of the world, they are allowed to work as far as the laws of these countries are concerned. And then the third part is that there is also a perception or a reality in terms of, some of the businesses within the value chain of tourism, especially in the hospitality sector, who are being perceived to be hiring, foreign, migrants in a larger numbers than South Africans. So we need to deal with the reality and we need to deal with the perception. But what I think the bill seeks to achieve is to put a quota in terms of how do we manage and harmonize, this working space so that there is no animosity, between those that are here legally and the South Africans that live in the country. So it is, again, open for public comment. We will comment to it. We do believe that in the formal value chain of tourism here in South Africa, 99% of people who work are South Africans. There will be few people that are not coming from South Africa. As in many other countries, there are South Africans that are working in hotels as general managers. There are people who are coming from the continent that work here in South Africa within the hospitality sector, being GMs or being sent here by some of these global brands, and they are allowed to work in the country. So the issue that we need to deal with is the perception and also the issue of those that are working that are not supposed to work within the country, and the law must take its course, and we need to be able to control the situation.
All right, so finally, as we wrap up, South Africa's tourism figures put it second only to Morocco on the continent. And we've seen a number of African countries finally start to take the issue of tourism more seriously. It's much more sustainable. It can provide more jobs than many of the other options that we have in front of us. What three things do you think other countries can learn from South Africa, even though it will be competition, but in order to boost tourism in their respective countries? Just your top three, looking at what South Africa has done in terms of being able to make its tourism sector such a globally appealing one.
Well, number one is that, make sure that, the infrastructure that's there, it's world class. This goes to hotels. When we say it's a 3-star, let it be 3-star, let it be comparable to the world. One thing that we've done well is that our tourism products are really par or exceed many in the world. And, and therefore a lot of people, love that. Number two, our safaris, are world class. There are other countries that do compete with us within the African continent, but we make sure that, when you go there, you really experience something that's unique, that's different, that you can go back home and ensure that, the people that are left at home desire to come and visit the country. The third one is that, make sure that the pricing is competitive, because there's always other destination that can substitute the destination. So let's make sure that we price correctly and we offer the services that we said we're going to offer. And if we do that right, we should be able to thrive as a destination. More importantly, don't forget to include the communities. Don't forget to include young people and people with disabilities within the tourism space. We all need to benefit from it, and we can do better as an African continent by not competing, but complementing each other and making sure that we invite the world to Africa.
All right, we invite the world to Africa. Tshifhiwa, Tshivhengwa, thank you so much for joining me. I know we'll be touching base with you, especially as we see the national labor migration policy take shape and as the tourism sector in South Africa continues to open up. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
All right. And we are inviting the world to Africa. South Africa is not the only country easing up on COVID-era regulations and restrictions. We're going to be seeing a rash of that in the coming weeks as more countries make decisions on how we live with the COVID-19 virus. But beyond that, the resilience of small businesses and the integration of regions, lessons that must be learned from COVID-19 when we had to look inward and the world was cut off. I think it's something for us to think about. You're watching Business Edge. Up next is NC4 to watch. And the world is still feeling the effects of the Russia-Ukraine conflict as rising shipping costs as a result of the ongoing conflict. And this comes from the International Monetary Fund, and it's likely that this may aggravate inflation in Nigeria and other countries around the world. The cost of transporting a container over the world's transoceanic commerce routes has climbed 7-fold in the first 18 months of the financial year, according to reports. Mozambique is about to begin a new sponsored program with the International Monetary Fund 6 years after the lender suspended its previous agreement following a debt crisis. The IMF and the government established a staff-level agreement for a 3-year extended credit facility program, which would provide the African country with about $470 million in loans. The IMF Board of Directors might approve the program by June if Mozambique passes a legislation governing a proposed sovereign wealth fund that would supervise billions of dollars in revenue projections from natural gas projects set to begin next year. Oil prices dropped on Tuesday, extending losses from the previous day as Ukraine and Russia headed for peace talks and on fears of a drop in fuel demand in China after the financial hub of Shanghai shut down to curb a new surge in COVID-19 cases. And finally, Cathay Pacific Airlines plans to reroute its New York-Hong Kong service to avoid Russian airspace. in what would be the world's longest commercial passenger flights by distance. The distance of some 16,618 kilometers would surpass Singapore Airlines' New York service, which takes about 17 and a half hours to cover 15,349 kilometers. And the new Cathay flights will take about 17 hours. And that's what we have for you on today's Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me. Don't forget to follow us on social media, subscribe to our YouTube channel, download our mobile app, and take us with you wherever you go across the continent and around the world. I'm Tolulope Adeleru-Balogun.